Do you have
things that we give away, cleaning out our closets as we, let's get along in years and we're looking to move stuff along. But books and things like this to give away. All right, I'm going to read some stuff to introduce Kate. I've known Kate for a number of years. It's better if I read it, otherwise I'll start telling stories about it.
no stories? No, I'm kidding.
And maybe I should speak into the laptop as well.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Kate Sutherland, our speaker tonight, she moved to Hatteras down on the coast in 2001 to work for Seabirds, a company that runs the pelagic birding tours. Some of you have probably been on some of those tours. It's out, they go out to the Gulf Stream, and that's where the Black-capped Petrel is the signature species. In 2016, she also began helping Bob Flood, who leads the Cahal Experience, and that's a tour to Bermuda, see the Bermuda petrel, which is known as the Cahal. And that's another endangered petrel. 2019, found her on her first research cruise out of Woods Hole as a seabird observer as part of a trip to study beaked whales. I mean, really, once you're out in the ocean, you're wanting to look at everything, whales and sea turtles and seabirds. It's all really cool stuff out there. But her niche is seabirds, and offshore is her habitat. She recently earned her master's in marine biology at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington. She's investigating the foraging ecology of black-capped petrels by looking at stable isotopes in feathers. She'll talk a little bit about that. So she had to use specimens and historical specimens, the kind of stuff we have here at the museum, and we pretty much have the only ones that she could look at. So she spent a few days here getting feather samples off of our specimens for that work. And many moons ago, so I asked people when I'm going to introduce speakers, I say, tell me a little something different about you. And so many moons ago, she put it, while living in Virginia, she cared for one of the first flocks of sandhill cranes that was part of that Operation Crane Migration to get them trained to fly and reintroduced to the east. So where they used an ultralight, to fly them from Ontario down to Virginia and some down to Florida. Our former assistant director here was one of the drivers of the chase craft. So he would follow the ultralight with the radio and all that kind of stuff. So
that was the very first year, so it was a test with sandhill cranes that were not shipped. Yeah, and a long time of that.
So you were, and then it went, and it morphed from sandhill to whooping crane.
Yeah, the whole point was to be able to see if it would work. So
to see if it would work, and our assistant director ended up doing the whooping crane stuff with the as a driver for the chase vehicle, they called it. So. Right. So what was really fun about what Kate did is that she dressed up like a crane for 4 months as a caretaker. She had to dress in a costume to be a crane. But as she puts it, the cranes were much more intelligent than that, and they recognized her with or without her costume. But with that, we welcome, a big thanks to Kate for driving up from Hatteras today to talk to us about there's a lot of stuff going on offshore, right? There's the wind energy development. There's always gas and oil exploration. There's the tourism, fishing, a lot of stuff going on. I asked her to come out and talk about all that with an eye towards seabirds. So here she is, Kate. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm hoping that I can turn this so that people on Zoom can see me and hear me. So I changed the title of this a number of times because John said, just tell us about what goes on offshore from Hatteras. What do we have off of our coast? So I finally came up with seabird selections because we're going to go through the seasons offshore from Hatteras, North Carolina, the winter, spring, and summer, the different species that we can see. I'm going to talk a little bit about black-capped petrels, which I think are really like the most incredible birds, and share a little bit of my research with you. And we're going to talk some about the offshore wind energy here in North Carolina, some of the plans for that and how that could impact species like black-capped petrels. So I always like to start just explaining to people, why do we make you drive to Hatteras? Because when you look at the east coast of the US, the continental shelf is there in that pale blue, and the pinch point is there on Hatteras Island. So we're the closest to deep water on the east coast. We can take a day trip and be out in water that's over a mile deep. The other reason this is important is we're also very close to the Gulf Stream. We have the Gulf Stream moving to the northeast offshore from Hatteras, and that's combined with the Virginia current or the Labrador current, a cold water current that's moving down from the north. These water masses move throughout the year. So in the wintertime, we have prevailing northerly winds, and that pushes that cooler water down around Cape Hatteras. So Cape Hatteras is right here. And then in the summer, we have prevailing southerly winds. Those kind of push the warmer water up along the southern coast of Hatteras Island, so south of Cape Point there. And then we're also close to the shelf break. So when you have water masses like this coming together, it creates a deposition zone. So you have a fallout of nutrients when the cold and warm water come together. This makes the area east of Hatteras Island incredibly productive. So it's not just good for seabirds, it's also good for a number of cetacean species, and also it's really good for fishing, if any of you do any offshore fishing. So I wanted to show you where we run our trips from. So I moved to Hatteras a long time ago, and at that time, we mostly ran trips from Hatteras Inlet. So you can see we're pretty close to the shelf break in Hatteras. But over the last 5 to 10 years, we've noticed, especially in the wintertime, the water is staying warmer south of Cape Hatteras. So that Gulf Stream influenced water is kind of butting up against Hatteras Island into the winter months. We weren't seeing as many of the cold water species that we focus on in the wintertime. So now our primary port of departure for our winter trips is Oregon Inlet to the north. So you can see there's a lot of shelf there, so it takes a bit to get to the deep water. But in the wintertime, we're not really concerned with going to the deep water. Most of what we're looking for, we can find in the cold waters right offshore from Oregon Inlet. So we're going to start with the winter. Here you can see this sea surface temperature map from Rutgers University. It shows that cold water, what I was talking about, coming down around the tip of Cape Hatteras. And you can see the Gulf Stream, which is offshore from North Carolina all year. We always have that warm water current moving by. It just varies in how close it is. I put our winter schedule here because we do have that posted. Some of those trips are already full, but if anyone is interested in joining us, we do have some available, and some of you might already be planning to join us for those. So when people come to Hatteras, the species they're mostly looking for is great skua. This is a really difficult bird to see in the US. We see them on about half of the trips we run from Hatteras. So this is a bird, when you come offshore with us in the winter, you're like, oh, please, I hope I see one of those. And then we have some other species that are even higher than that, right? This is a yellow-nosed albatross. We've had yellow-nosed albatross and also black-browed albatross offshore from Hatteras. So these are the two species of albatross that have been documented in North Carolina. So we also have the usual suspects, northern gannets. I imagine most of you are probably familiar with the northern gannet because you can see them from the beach. The young individuals are dark, like this bird here, and then the adults are these beautiful white birds with a yellowish head and black on the wingtips. And if you ever get to see their feet, they have really cool, like green lines on top of their feet. But it does take them a number of years to reach that adult plumage. So a lot of times throughout the winter, you'll see birds in varying age classes, like this individual here, which still has these dark secondaries and a lot of dark feathering in the back. But you can pretty much plan to see northern gannets on a winter trip with us. Some of the other birds you can plan to see are gulls, lots of gulls, usually herring gulls, lesser blackback gulls. We have a crew that is feeding the birds all day long to keep a good flock of gulls and gannets to attract that great skua to the boat. Razorbills are another species that we see regularly offshore in the wintertime. So that's kind of something that you would expect to see on a winter trip with us. And Bonaparte skulls, we get hundreds and hundreds of Bonaparte skulls, and it's a lot of fun to see these birds from the beach, but also on a boat. So then we have a lot of species that are toss-ups. We move into birds that we don't see on every trip, but you can always hope to see them. And Atlantic puffin is one of those. We've had really good luck with Atlantic puffins since we started running trips to the north up there from Oregon Inlet. And we've even broken the record. I think Ed was with us when we broke the record for the state of North Carolina for the most Atlantic puffins seen in a day. But we don't see them all the time. So that's why it's one of those birds that you're hoping to see. They're also small, like these murres. We have common murre here in the center and a thick-billed murre there on the left. Two more species that we hope to see. And actually, since we've started running those trips from Oregon Inlet, we found it's a really good place. We've had good numbers of common murres, especially over the last few years, and also some good sightings of thick-billed murres as well. You can see the water is quite calm in all of these pictures because when it's not calm, it can be a little more challenging to get an eye on those birds, much less a photograph of them. Winter is a really good time to see Manx shearwaters. So they like the colder water. And so on the winter trips, this picture was taken on a winter trip. So I'm not cheating and throwing something else in there, but you can get some really great photo ops with Manx shearwaters in the winter. But again, we don't see them on every trip. So it's just kind of like a toss-up. Red phalarope is another species that we see commonly in the winter time. And also we don't see them on every trip. They're quite small. A lot of times they'll be near temperature breaks or along little foam lines that we sometimes find offshore. You can see again, it's pretty calm there. So they can be a challenge to get your eyes on if it's a rough day, and also a challenge to photograph. Black-legged kittiwake. I actually forgot to put this in. So I was driving here today thinking, what other bird? Oh my gosh, the kittiwakes. Because we usually see them in January and we haven't been running a lot of trips in January, but I would be leaving them out if I didn't include them in something you could possibly see on our winter trips, because it's also a species you could see from shore in the wintertime. So a good one to keep an eye out for. This, of course, is a young individual. The adults look quite different with a gray back and all black wingtips. So the wingtips look like they're dipped in ink. So little gull is another species we're looking for, but we don't see them on every trip. But with all the Bonaparte skulls, usually if you put your time in, searching through the flocks of Bonaparte skulls, you can find a little gull. And it looks like, what an easy thing to pick out, right? With the dark underwings, but they're amazingly good at disappearing in a flock of Bonaparte skulls, especially when it's a busy day and there's a lot going on. So that's why you have leaders on the boat like us to help you all, like myself and Ed, to help you all get your eye on those when they're hard to find. Some of the others we hope to see are the white-winged gulls, like the Kumlean skull or Iceland gull and glaucous gull. A lot of times we're seeing young individuals, but occasionally we will see some older glaucous gulls or Iceland gulls on those trips as well. And northern fulmar is a species that we always hope to see, but is kind of hit or miss. They're either around or they're not around. So either we see them in a year or we don't see them. And they're also tube noses, which we'll talk about in just a minute, but they can smell the fish that we're throwing out. And if they're around and they're hungry, they'll come right in there with the gulls and fight for some of that food. And they're scrappy little birds. They're smaller than most of the gulls, but they definitely get their fair share. Dovekie. Doesn't everyone want to see one of those? They fit in your hand. They're super cute. But again, they're either around or they're not. Like some years they show up. I think this year might be a good year for them because there have been really good numbers up north. So I'm hoping that it'll be a good year for them. But some years they're all over the place, and other years you can look really hard and not find them. So if it's a species you're hoping for, I would say keep an eye on our blog and trip reports. And if they're around, I would say just sign up for one of the later trips. There's usually space on those. This is a Black-capped Petrel. We're going to talk about those as we move on. But occasionally in the wintertime, we get to the Gulf Stream edge and we'll see a Black-capped Petrel. We don't see them every year, but it's a super exciting species to see offshore in the wintertime from Hatteras. Okay, so we're going to move to the spring. You guys are taking this all in, right? It's taking notes. We won't have to help you at all. You'll be the ones when you sign up. I'll be like, oh, they went to the top. They can help everyone else. So our spring trips, I wanted to include a map again with that sea surface temperature so you can see how that's changing, right? We have some warmer water coming up against the coast, and then that really hot Gulf Stream current that's moving quite quickly offshore. This is from early May of this year, well, mid-May, mid to late May, May 21st of 2023. And we do have our spring schedule posted. April, we don't run trips really that much in March, and we've tried to run trips in April. It's a really good time to be offshore, and we actually had trips scheduled for this past April and canceled them for lack of participation. And then Brian and I went out to work, and we had a Bermuda petrel and like tons of other species out there on an April trip. So it's an exciting time to be out there. So if you want to do that, keep an eye out. But this year we're not starting our spring trips until May, and then we'll run through the beginning of June. So I want to take a minute and explain to you all what a tube-nosed seabird is, because maybe not everyone is familiar with the order Procelariformes. These are the tube-nosed seabirds, like this Bermuda petrel here. This is actually a Bermuda petrel in Bermuda being held by the Chief Conservation Officer, Jeremy Medeiros. And you can see this tubular structure here on the bill. So these birds spend their entire lives at sea, which means that they are drinking salt water, right? They're not running into a lake to get some fresh water. All of their time is spent at sea. So they have specialized salt glands to be able to take that salt out of the water, and they excrete a briny solution from those structures on their bill to get rid of that salt. The other thing that's really special about these birds is they have a highly developed sense of smell. So they have a large olfactory bulb. These tubes serve to focus scent molecules on that olfactory part of their brain. And so if you can imagine, we navigate our world like a landscape using visual cues. And these birds are able to navigate the seas like a scentscape. So they're using scent cues as they're flying around at sea. They can smell food, they can smell different currents, ocean currents, different underwater features, produce different food on the surface that will smell different. They also are typically coming and going to their colonies at night. So they only come to land to reproduce themselves. And when they do that, it's usually dark, and they nest in burrows that have no light. So they're using their sense of smell not only to relocate where they came from, but also to recognize their mate. So they're pretty incredible species, which you'll as you listen to me talk about them, you'll realize they're kind of some of my favorites. So we'll start with the genus Pterodroma. Pterodroma means winged runner. These birds are incredible flyers. This is the genus of the Black-capped Petrel. We'll go through each of these species on a separate slide. But they're also called the gadfly petrels. And gadfly petrel likely comes from their previous genus, Oestrelata, which meant to be goaded by a gadfly. Again, probably referring to their flight style. They have this really dynamic flight style. So these are some of the species that we can see offshore from North Carolina. And the Black-capped Petrel, like John mentioned, this is our signature species. This bird is present offshore from North Carolina 365 days a year. I think they should be the state bird, but if anyone knows who I can, like put in a petition for the Black-capped Petrel. Anyhow, they're quite gorgeous seabirds, and they have this big white upper tail, which is kind of the diagnostic characteristic for a Black-capped Petrel. We also see the Phaeus type petrels. This is actually a complex of two different species that look very similar. We mostly see the Desertus petrel offshore from Hatteras, but if you come offshore with us, you'll still hear it called the Phaeus petrel. They have a nice gray upper part with a pale tail, and then these really dark underwings. So that stands out, that white belly and the dark underwings. Now, this is a species that North Carolina can lay claim to. It was seen offshore from North Carolina in the late 90s and photographed by Brian Patteson, was not accepted for a number of years. But the Xenos petrel, obviously these photos were taken in Madeira. They were not taken offshore from Hatteras because I wasn't on that trip. But I like to remind people that it will happen again, and we just need to remember to keep our eyes peeled. The Xenos petrel looks very similar to the Phaeus type petrels, but it has more white in the underwings, and it has this nice tiny little bill there. The Desertus petrels have quite a large bill. You can see in this individual over here. And then the Bermuda petrel. This bird is a Lazarus species, so is thought to be extinct for a number of years, rediscovered in the 1950s. the very first photographic records of this species were taken offshore from Hatteras by Brian Patteson. Some of the first sightings at sea of this species were off of the Carolinas, North and South Carolina. They're really gorgeous, a very gorgeous bird to see. We get a lot of people who come from all over the world hoping to have a chance to see this bird. Trindade petrels are another species of gadfly petrel that we see typically in the spring and into the summer. So all of these you could see almost any time of year, but spring into summer. These birds are all dark above. They are shaped a little bit differently from the other gadfly petrels, but you would probably need to spend some time with us to pick that out. And now we're going to move on to another group of tube noses, the shearwaters. So there are a few different species we'll go through here. These are the black and white shearwaters. We already talked about the Manx shearwater, right, with the winter trips. So you saw some pictures of that. Well, we do also see them offshore in the spring. So each of these, as we go through, there are going to be some notes about when we see them underneath the images, just in case I forget to say them. And these two are kind of considered a confusion pair, but a Manx shearwater actually weighs twice as much as an Audubon's. And when you see them moving around at sea, the Audubon's are small and fluttery, a lot of times staying close to the water. Manx shearwaters are much more powerful flyers with pretty stiff wings and gliding a bit as they do that. A Manx also has a white undertail and kind of a short tail with a dark face, while this Audubon's has a nice long tail with dark undertail coverts and a sort of a smaller, shorter bill there. It depends on the conditions, how they fly. So I always say that's why you have us there to help you if you need any help or to tell you what you're looking at. So some of the other species that start to show up in the spring are the great shearwater here on the left. They're a very snappy looking shearwater with a black cap and a black bill. They usually show up late May, early June. These birds are nesting in the southern hemisphere. So they're making a really long journey to get to us in Hatteras. And when they show up, they're very hungry. So we usually can get pretty good looks at them because they come in very well to the chum, especially when they first show up. Sooty shearwater is a species that we tend to see, another species that's coming from the southern hemisphere, going all the way up north past Cape Hatteras to the more productive waters off of New England. But they move by every spring. And if we have some good, strong easterly winds, it pushes them right up against the beach. And you can stand at Cape Point with a scope and count sooty shearwaters all day while we're offshore looking at Bermuda petrels. And then we get to see them when we come back in. We see them in the morning when we're leaving and in the afternoon when we come back in, but it's really just a short period of time. Some years are better than others. It really just depends on the conditions. Cories and scopoles shearwaters. So these are they are two species in some places in the world and subspecies here. So we keep track of them because if it ever happens that they do split them, then you'll have them on your list, right? The Cory shearwater is mostly nesting in the Atlantic. They're quite large. They're the largest shearwater that we see offshore. So they're quite large bodied with a big bill, and then they have these dark under primaries. The Scopoles shearwaters, which you might be able to see, they're a little bit slighter and smaller. They also have white extending into those under primaries. Right now, that's really the only criteria that we use for telling them apart at sea. It's quite likely a lot of Scopoles shearwaters have dark underwings, but we won't get into that. You can ask me about it if you come on a trip, because I can talk about it for a long time. Anyhow, Scopoles are nesting in the Mediterranean, and then again, the Cories are nesting in the Atlantic. There are some size differences as well. So sometimes it can be easier to pick out those Scopoles if they're in the slick with a great shearwater, for example. A Cories is much larger than a great shearwater. A Scopoles is closer in size to a great shearwater or sometimes smaller. Now we're moving on to the smallest tube noses that we see offshore. So the Wilson storm petrel here on the left is a pretty spectacular species that nests in Antarctica and on subantarctic islands. They're small seabirds with long legs and these kind of like paddle-shaped wings with this nice rectangular looking paler patch on their upper wings. When you see them flying, they fly like a butterfly or a swallow. They don't seem like they've flown all the way from the bottom of the world, heading up to the top and then to go back again. But this is our main species that follows us in this slick. We put out fish oil once we get offshore, and these birds can smell it and come in. Some days we'll have, as you know, a few hundred Wilson storm petrels following behind the boat. And the first thing we tell people is watch the Wilsons, study the Wilsons, because if you learn how they fly, then you can pick out something different, like this European storm petrel or British storm petrel, which we see very rarely. It's smaller than a Wilson storm petrel. It has short legs and the wings are differently colored. They don't have that pale patch, and they have a white stripe under their wings. So it seems like, oh, it should be pretty simple to pick out if we saw it, but no, it's not. It's not as simple as it sounds. But if you've been studying the Wilson storm petrels, you might have a better chance at seeing this bird that flies a little bit differently and looks a little bit different from the Wilsons. So moving on to the big storm petrels, which are bigger than Wilson storm petrels, but still not as big as the shearwaters. Another species, two more species that you would be keyed in on if you've been watching and studying the Wilson storm petrels, you would notice they fly differently. Their wings are a little bit longer. And then when you look at the two species, you see the bandrump storm petrel has this nice, narrow, clean upper tail. And the leeches has kind of a little bit of a messier V-shaped upper tail. They also have a forked tail versus this nice square tail in the bandrumps. The bandrumps actually have a number of different species in there, a number of cryptic species. This is a winter breeding bandrump storm petrel known as a Grant's storm petrel. You can see it's molting in its outer primaries there. So that's what we use to be able to tell those apart. There are some other types of bandrump storm petrels, some smaller non-molting bandrumps that we see offshore, but we haven't really figured out the criteria for being able to tell those apart at sea. So we're going to move on to the Jaegers and skuas, more exciting birds to see, but not necessarily tube noses. These birds are more tuned in to looking for other birds that they can attack to give them their food. So they will harass other birds. They're known as kleptoparasites. They steal food from other species. South polar skua is a very large bird. They're not as big as the great skua that we saw on the first slide, but they're still quite large. Another species that nests in Antarctica and comes all the way up to the north and then makes that circuit again around the sea. They show up typically in the springtime. When we get really good east winds, sometimes we'll have really good numbers of South polar skuas, and they will continue all the way into the fall. We've seen them as late as October offshore from Hatteras. Then the Jaegers, will start with our largest Jaeger, and the one we most commonly see offshore is the Pomeranian Jaeger, which is quite a hefty bird, and they have these really cool central tail feathers that are long, thick, and twisted. That is a diagnostic feature for them. If they have them, they don't always have them. And again, it takes them a number of years to reach their adult plumage. So Jaegers can be quite confusing, but I wanted to give you just a nice simple one to start. So you can start with this one. We also see long-tailed Jaegers and parasitic Jaegers on these trips. Long-tailed Jaeger, we see more often offshore, a lot of times in the springtime. And then as we move into the summer, we'll see some of the young birds coming back from the Arctic in their beautiful juvenile plumage. And then parasitic Jaegers, we don't see quite as often offshore. You might have better luck seeing those from the beach, chasing some terns around. A lot of times you'll see them right in those coastal areas. We would be remiss if we didn't mention the tropic birds. I know at least one person's been waiting for tropic birds. We see both species, red-billed and white-tailed tropic birds, both species that are nesting in our area. Red-billed tropic birds, typically we tend to see in the spring. These birds are also in more shallow water on the shelf, transiting to and from the deep water of the Gulf Stream. You can see they have these dark coverts there. That's one of the features that you'll use to tell them apart from the white-tailed tropic bird, which just has the black primaries there. There's also some differences in size and shape, but that takes a little bit of time to get used to. So that's why you have us to tell you what you're looking at. We do see a number of terns offshore. Arctic terns tend to move through early in the season. A lot of times we'll see them even in April. And common terns, a lot of times we'll see them throughout the season, spring, summer, and into the fall. Last year, we had more roseate terns offshore than we had Arctic terns. It's the first time that's ever happened. We don't usually see a lot of roseate terns offshore, but there have been some showing up now for the past couple of years at Cape Point right there, Cape Hatteras, and we've started seeing them offshore. So I had to add them to the mix. We also see phalaropes. We talked about the red phalarope with the winter trips, but then we'll see them again in the springtime, a lot of times mixed in with flocks of redneck phalaropes. So the redneck phalaropes have these nice, small, kind of thin looking bills, and the red phalaropes have a much larger bill. And we're going to move to the summer, which I tried to get Brian to give me the summer schedule before I came, and he was like, I don't know, not quite ready. So yeah, but hopefully this summer we'll have some trips again running from Oregon Inlet up to the north. So you can see here how the water temperature again is changing. We have warmer water. This looks like it's cool, but it's like they change these charts all the time. It's actually in the 80s. I mean, so anyhow, but we get the really warm water in the summer months, and sometimes it's more productive to go east of Oregon Inlet. So we have started a set of trips running from the northern port in the summertime. The tropical terns, the sooty and bridal terns, we can see in the spring, but their stronghold is really the summer. And it's exciting to see them in the summer because they have their young ones with them. So the young terns will travel with their parents, and sometimes you'll see them actually being fed out there at sea. It's pretty incredible. So we have sooty tern here with these dark under primaries versus the white under primaries of the bridal tern. And there's that young bridal tern sulking on the board. And a nice picture of these. The young sooty terns are really spectacular. They're gorgeous and chocolatey, and they're very loud. You don't miss them. A lot of times you'll hear them before you even see a flock of sooty terns. So we also see the boobies a little bit more often in the summer months. These birds are specializing on flying fishes. When the Gulf Stream is really in and running strong, there are a lot of flying fishes out there. So perfect for the boobies to be out there as well. Again, we can see these in the spring, but the habitat is a little bit better for them as we move into the summer. So masked booby here on the left, and then brown booby on the right. Okay, enough ID. We're going to move on to the black-capped petrels. So I wanted to share some information about the black-capped petrel, which is locally known as the diablotine. This is the species, of course, that I did my master's research on. So I just wanted to give you some background on this species that makes its home, like its entire life cycle happens offshore from Hatteras. So this is just a map showing the current distributions. And down here, you can see confirmed nesting locations. They only nest on one island in the Caribbean. That's all we know of. There have to be more because we see a lot of them offshore, but we don't know where they're nesting. The pterodroma petrels are notoriously difficult to study because they do come and go from their colonies at night. And a lot of times they're nesting in totally inhospitable locations for humans, not for them. They're perfectly happy where they are. So we hope that they're nesting on some other islands in the Caribbean, but we're not sure. What I will point out is that these birds are ranging all the way farther up to the northeast, and some of them have been found on the other side of the Atlantic. I don't believe that these birds are on the shelf, but it could just have been the way they printed that map. So I wanted to share with you a map of Hispaniola, right? Hispaniola is the island that's home to Haiti and the Dominican Republic. It's hard enough to be a human in Haiti. Imagine being a seabird. The most nesting burrows that have been found to date are located in Haiti. There are a handful of colonies in Dominican Republic as well, but Haiti is, for some reason, that is just currently their stronghold. So what we have here in blue, the different mountain ranges there. So these birds nest in the mountains, like 6,000 feet up burrowing underneath trees. And then here in black, we have the colonies of black-capped petrels that we currently know of. They're all monitored. They do make artificial nesting burrows for them. There's a lot of work being done for these birds on the ground, but they still need more help. So the black-capped petrel comes in 2 different color forms, and there's some variation in between. So we have light form black-capped petrels. We tend to see more in the springtime. They have this little black cap and a white nape. They have a lot of white under the wing, all the way down to these really dark individuals, which are smaller. They have a really dark face and a dark nape. So this is just a little sketch that I made for those different facial patterns. In 2014, they tagged the first black-capped petrels from the colonies. So they were trying to figure out where they were going. They were able to see that they were moving to the south when they were breeding. So when they had eggs or had chicks, and then they're foraging east of, here we are, Hatteras, right there. But they're definitely staying in that deeper water offshore of the shelf break. Of course, this is only 3 individuals. And I think they're hopeful that they're going to be able to get some more tags out actually this coming season or next season. So the big question was, like, where do the pale bird, where are the light form birds nesting? All the dark form, all the birds that we're seeing in Hispaniola are dark form birds, like this one here with that dark hind collar, right? So no one could find a light form bird in any of the burrows there in Hispaniola. So in 2019, American Bird Conservancy, after years of trying to figure out how could we catch these birds at sea, imported this gentleman back here, Chris Gaskin from New Zealand, with his special net gun, and we loaded this Zodiac onto the Stormy Petrel 2. That's the boat that we have for doing the seabirding trips, and went way offshore, put out a big slick and popped that thing in the water. They were able to catch 10 black-capped petrels, the first time they've ever been caught at sea. They caught 5 light form and 5 dark form individuals and put satellite tags on them. So you can see the tag on the back of this individual here. This is one of the dark form birds there on the boat, I think being held by Yvonne. And here's me releasing a light form bird. Again, you can see that, like the antenna there on the back from that tag. And then this is a map showing the tracks of those birds. So they were tagged here, southeast of Hatteras Inlet, and they ranged all the way up off of New England to the deeper water, like the shelf break up there east of Cape Cod in Massachusetts. And you can see 2 birds returned to Hispaniola. So there were only 2 tags that were still transmitting when the birds went back to the nesting colony. Of course, they tagged them in May. So it's a long time for those tags to stay on and be working. But it was pretty exciting that 2 of them made it back. And this was a light form bird. And they're like, wait a minute. So this bird went back to Hispaniola. So now we know, yes, there are light form individuals that are nesting there on Hispaniola. One thing that we've noticed on our trips is that the molt timing is different for these birds. So there's been work done on the light and dark forms of black-capped petrels using the museum specimens here in the past. We know there are 2 distinct nesting populations, but we don't know, are they subspecies, are they species? You know, what's really going on with these? This bird came back in September, a month before the other individual came back. So the light form bird is nesting sooner, returning to the colony at least, sooner than the dark form birds, indicating that temporal segregation in their nesting. Oh, sorry. And here are the kids from the museum. So what I got to do, I wanted to know, can I use stable isotope analysis, that's SIA, and mercury analysis to investigate the foraging ecology of these 2 different forms of black-capped petrels? Can I tell, are the light forms doing something differently than the dark forms by using feathers from these historic specimens and running these analyses on them? So I went back to university in 2021. I think COVID foiled my plans to be living on research vessels forever. And Dr. Steve Emsley at UNC-W took me on as a student. He does a lot of stable isotope work, and he let me design my own project. I was like, I want to do this thing and I want to know. And so do whatever you want. You just have to get permission from John to take these, to pluck feathers from these birds. So I was able to look at the 65 specimens that we have here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. And this, it looks like a jumbled mess. But what we have is we have a couple of spatial isotopes. So I use the carbon and sulfur. These tell us about where birds are foraging in relation to shore. So are they foraging close to land? Are they foraging way out in the ocean? And then nitrogen tells us where they're feeding in their trophic level. Are they eating phytoplankton? Probably not. Are they eating zooplankton? Probably not. But that's what you can learn from looking at stable isotopes of nitrogen. And then mercury, we were really just curious what the mercury levels were going to be, especially in these historic specimens. So what I found is these birds are feeding offshore. We kind of knew that. They're not feeding on phytoplankton. We kind of knew that. But it's the first time that this has ever been done for black-capped petrels. So irregardless of what I found, we now have a baseline for future studies with stable isotope analysis for black-capped petrels. And the mean total mercury was almost 27 parts per million, which I'm sure many of you have read about mercury. You know, even 5 parts per million in many bird species can be deadly and have detrimental effects. But the black-capped petrels and other gadfly petrels have quite high levels of mercury. For a long time, this was a mystery. No one really knew how this was happening, and they're finding these really fascinating food prey items in the fecal matter of like Bermuda petrels, for example, which we're able to study because we have a colony that you can work with there in Bermuda. They're finding all of these deep water species that these birds are feeding on. We're like, we know they can't dive, you know, over 600 meters. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard about that the greatest migration on Earth, that diurnal migration from animals that live below the photic zone in the ocean and come up into the surface waters at night to feed and then head back down to below the photic zone for the daytime. Gadfly petrels are specialized in feeding on some of these prey species. They also tend to be higher in mercury because they're in an area without oxygen. So this is kind of like a little bit of a link, and finding this with black-capped petrels is just one more piece of the puzzle. So no differences in the foraging ecology of these birds, but there was very little variability in these 65 specimens collected over 11 years. And that really spoke to these birds utilizing a very specific foraging location. So likely they're in the Gulf Stream. So even if we have light form birds that might be off of New England, they're still using Gulf Stream influenced waters. Even if we have dark form birds that are using waters off of the Carolinas, they're still using the Gulf Stream influenced waters, which would give us these very similar isotopic ratio values. So I feel like that was a great finding. So we're going to move into talking a little bit about wind energy. It's just a couple of slides. I was not well versed in what we have going on offshore from North Carolina. I'm sure some of you might be better versed in this than I am. Right now, I think they're going through their kind of environmental impact stage for the Kitty Hawk North Wind project up here. This, of course, is going to Virginia. And then the Carolina Long Bay project, it's 2 different companies that have those leases. I couldn't really find where they stand, so I don't even know if they've begun that process yet of doing their EIS. What I was really more concerned about are these deep water WEAs, or wind energy areas, that they have out here. They have already removed some portions of those because of things like black-capped petrels. But this is the space that those birds are utilizing. So I'll be really curious to see what happens with these areas in the future. Right now, they're just call areas. So these are places that BOEM and other partners have decided would be viable locations for wind development. Of course, there would be floating turbines going out to many thousands of meters in depth. So the project with the black-capped petrels that were tagged, Yvonne was able to make these heat maps with the 2 different color forms. Of course, we're talking about 10 birds, but bear with me. The blue are the dark form individuals and the yellow is the light form individuals. And we can break that out a little bit more clearly here, but you can see in red, the red polygons are wind areas or proposed wind areas. So these polygons here are part of those larger WIAs that we were looking at in the last slide, the green spaces. And even the light form birds also overlap with that. The purple that was up to the top, those were petroleum leases for the Canadian Maritimes. But anyhow, I just thought that this was very telling, and we're keeping our voices in the ears of people doing a lot of the planning. I actually sat and watched the meeting they had about the deep water planning. It was like 3 hours long, but the only species that was mentioned in those talks was Black-capped Petrel. So I guess we're doing a good job so far. So I know a lot of species may not be impacted by this type of development, but Black-capped Petrels, the way that they fly, I have a feeling they could have some detrimental impact. So I'm hoping my work showing they're tied to this very specific habitat and also more tagging work will help us make some informed decisions about them in the future. All right, thank you all so much. We had to include a cryptic species of banded storm petrel. This is photographed in the Azores. And if you want to talk about it, you can come offshore. This is a Montero storm petrel. It looks very similar to the Vanrumps. But anyhow, if anyone wanted to get in touch with me, there's my information. You can take a picture of that. And that's it. Thank you all so much for having me.
We have time for questions.
Oh, good.
Questions
Was I
that were in the
really
chat were I could handle through Google searches and listening to you. So
Good.
are
Okay.
there any questions from anyone in the room?
Yes.
With Eric.
Black-capped Petrel is the stand fairly close to the water, even though they usually don't fly high up like cannons fly.
They will fly high depending on the wind.
Yeah. How do they come in contact, and in what way do they come in contact? Would they come in contact with wind turbines?
So it could be just a collision risk. And also if they're using the wind to get that high. So I think that no one really knows. But is it better to do something that we don't know for a species that is, oh yes, I forgot. See, John said.
Sometimes they can arc.
Oh no, I forgot to repeat the question. That's what I thought you're, So just repeating the question, Eric was asking, he felt that Black-capped Petrels usually fly close to the surface and they can arc pretty high, but was wondering how they would come in contact with wind turbines or that type of development. And I think you heard my answer, but yes, they can actually get a lot higher probably than we see them when we're offshore. And there are a number of records from the 1980s from Dave Lee and Ned Brinkley and Todd Haas of those birds, like almost kettling up quite high, like a 50 or 100 blackcaps. I know I've read about being up kind of the way that raptors will kettle. So I think there's a lot that we don't know about what that interaction would be. Yeah, we don't, because we don't see it very much. He was just saying that Brian doesn't usually point out the kettling on the bird trips. Yeah. Well, it's because it's better for humans on those days, you know, like we're not allowed to take you out when it's really good. That's coming from me. I don't get seasick. Safety. So, all right. Yes.
You were doing mercury analysis, right, on what the levels you were finding with those being concerned.
So the question was, I was doing mercury analysis on the Black-capped Petrel feathers, and would the levels that I found be of concern? And so when I first started looking at the results, I was concerned because some of them, the highest I found was 82 parts per million. The lowest was 3 parts per million. But it seems that a lot of seabirds, especially gadfly petrels, tend to have levels of mercury that are very similar to the levels that I found in the black-capped petrels. So obviously it does not harm them enough to cause them to not be able to reproduce, if that makes sense. And it's I don't know if it's true or, well, it's my theory that these birds possibly have evolved to be able to offload that mercury maybe a little bit easier than some other species have as part of their evolution. Yes.
I have a follow-up question to that from the folks on Zoom. Do older birds have higher levels of mercury than younger birds? And do we expect baby birds have any of the isotopes that you analyze?
So yes. So no first, yes second. So what the birds do is they store the mercury in their fat, and then when they're getting ready to molt their feathers, they're able to get it moving, and they deposit it in the feathers when they're growing them. So actually, when you're looking at a feather, you might have different levels of mercury from the top to the bottom of the feather. And females are able to offload mercury in their eggshells. So you're also able to get rid of it that way. So you can find high levels in, it doesn't, I guess what I'm trying to say is they're regularly getting rid of it through their natural cycles. And the stable isotopes are in everything. So the food that the parents are feeding their chicks will be in the feathers of the juvenile birds. So you would know what the parents were feeding on for that first set of feathers. So you would want to know kind of the age of the birds that you're investigating, what you would be getting, if that makes sense.
So, I want to be supportive of offshore wind energy.
We all do. I mean, but you know what I mean?
How
You know what I
worried
mean?
should we be about, and not just black-capped petrels, but gannets and all these other, how worried should we be about these big things that are going in off the coast of Massachusetts?
So
I mean, do we know what's going to happen, and will we ever know what does happen?
So I can, I was just at so the question was,
I typed it in the chat.
oh, thank you. So, I was just at the Waterbird Society annual meeting in Florida in October, and I don't know if anyone was at that. It was pretty fascinating, but a lot of it was about wind energy. And it was really interesting to hear. I mean, there are people there representing companies building turbines who are trying their hardest to make sure that everyone is comfortable with it. And the interesting thing was you see a lot of development in Europe. And so you think they've already figured out a lot of these effects, but in reality, they haven't. And and this is just from what I've heard and learned recently, we're taking things a lot slower, and we have a lot more research involved in what we're doing. I don't know. I mean, I can't answer because I'm not like an expert on wind energy. I know that some people say you have to take what you get when you're dealing with these things, but I don't know if there's anyone who's here who has a good answer. Give it to us, Ed Corey.
I was just gonna say, talking about harbour site and having that pre-existing monitoring, making sure everything is working through that area. That's something that we have a little bit more advantage of here, but not so much in Europe. So the more information we can get before a turbine setup goes in, the better we are.
Yep.
And not just for birds, for bats too.
Yeah. And everything. Yeah.
Fish, everybody's got it. Yeah,
Yeah.
that stakeholder group is pretty big.
Yeah. So it'll be, I say just so, because I've been like this about it, because I really I just didn't want to know. And so when John asked me to give this talk, I was like, oh, I have to look at it. So it's so now the thing is like, I'm curious, and I'm going to be following a lot of these different developments. And I know a lot of people in North Carolina are on, and then, you have like Duke is doing a lot of work for some of the current projects as well. There's a lot of research going into it, but I don't know.
From shore, sometimes you see these fish boils, and there'll be like thousands of gannets and cormorants and everything gathering there, and you're like, God,
how,
I hope they don't put a wind turbine right anywhere near something like that.
yeah, and,
But
you
those
know,
things move around.
and
Really?
south of like like up there in Nantucket Shoals, like I don't know. So we'll
But
see.
you guys who go out all the time, you probably do know the areas that are really hot spots.
It all changes, you know?
So it does change.
I mean, that's
what
the
I was reading.
thing. That's it, everything moves, like it's a very fluid and, you know, dynamic environment, and especially offshore from Hatteras, like we have it's a really happening place there.
So we have time for about maybe one more question in the room, and then I've got a couple of questions on chat, and we'll wrap it up.
This might be a ridiculous question. No, I'm not. But I'm curious as we see and, feel the warming water temperatures with climate change. Does that potentially impact how birds are able to smell changes in the ecosystem? I don't know if that's.
That's a good
connected, but-
question. You know, I don't know if it would necessarily change the way that they can smell. I know that it does maybe change some of the food availability.
Right.
And so species that are able, I walked away, sorry. So species that are able to make that change, like gadfly petrels, can travel thousands and thousands of miles to collect food for their chicks, but a puffin can't go quite as far. Not that they're a tube nose, but I think like some of the things that we're going to see is like that food availability, and species that have a more flexible foraging ecology might do better, and those that are more structured and strict. And again, it might go through phases. I mean, it's really hard to tell. I try to be hopeful that, but it definitely, it's like having that sense of smell for the tube noses, like being able to know where food is and find that food is a pretty important thing. We won't talk about plastic that smells like food. We're just not going to talk about that. We won't go down that rabbit hole. Okay.
Have we seen a steep decline in seabird populations as compared to land birds? And I don't know if that's something that you've really been studying.
I don't
Yeah.
pay,
If anyone
I
maybe
apologize
can
that I
also
don't
comment on that.
pay as much attention to land birds, but seabirds are declining drastically in a lot of different ways and
I'm
locations.
gonna depend on which seabird too.
Too, yes, that's right.
I think Wilson stone petrel is fine, but,
Mm,
but the volcanic island ones really need to take a real hit.
yeah. And the ones with the longer life cycles, like albatrosses, for example. Albatrosses are seeing steep decline, and then shearwaters, which are really generalists and eat a lot of plastic. It's like, even if you have a lot, there's still, there are so many different threats, but land birds, I've been keeping my head in the sand about them too, because I feel like they're having quite a bad time as well. So just with habitat destruction. Do you have more to say about the?
Well, there have been there's still hits with oil spills, there are hits with the plastic, as you say. There's the fruit shipping, the ocean currents changing, climate. And then there's still, fishing is still a problem with drip nets.
Yeah.
They still kill a lot of seabirds. in
Yep.
nets.
Yep.
But gulls and cormorants are doing pretty well.
Well, I don't consider it a seabird. but
Yeah.
You're right, they are. They're on land and sea.
Yeah, we won't talk too much about it, but I'm a strict seabird. Like spend most of their, even though I did have the Arctic tern in there. They travel quite far over the ocean. I don't know. All right.
Okay, I seem to have lost it in the chat,
Okay.
so I
So
think
we
we'll
can
wrap it
all-
up there. For those that are in the room, of course, you're not driving back to Hatteras tonight.
No,
right? So Kate
no.
will be hanging around up here if you have additional questions for her. We still have our auction items over here if anyone wants to swing by and take a look at those. There's a line to add your contact information, so if you happen to head out after you write your name down and you have the winning bid, we know how to contact you. And thank you once again for Kate, another round of applause.
Thank you, guys. No, thanks to everybody.
Yeah, if you have the stomach for it, definitely want to get out there and.
Now.
No, seriously. We're rarely lucky to have one of these birds show up at Jordan Lake, but.
I take very good care of seasick.
Yes, if you really want to see these birds, definitely get with Kate afterwards. And is there anything else I forgot? As John said, we've got some freebies back there, some giveaways. There's also some snacks. So please hang around and enjoy each other's company. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, can I do I'm gonna leave the meeting. That's okay?